I tested 10 different EDC belts in search of the best fit for me, and my hope is that this video will save you that trouble by giving you all of the information you need to find the best one for you. For years now, I have been carrying using just a standard leather belt, and it's honestly worked pretty much just fine. It hasn't been the best, but it still worked for me. I've tested out a couple of different EDC belts, and I didn't like any of them enough to keep using them. So I decided I wanted to see if I could find one that actually legitimately met my needs. I started off by doing a poll on my Instagram stories, asking people for recommendations. I took those recommendations and kind of whittled them down to, I think I had like 12 or 13, and then I just started reaching out to companies. So that's a disclaimer, I have more to come later, that every single one of these belts, with the exception of one, was sent to me by companies, and I told them up front, I am trying to compare every belt that I possibly can. Would you be willing to send a belt my way for the purposes of that video? And pretty much every company was like, oh yeah, sure, we'd love to see how our belt stacks up. So just keep that in mind as you watch this. Now, the first thing I want to say is there's a lot of information to go over here. So if you're just wanting to see how one belt stacks up against the other, feel free to skip ahead, because I have to do a little bit of an intro to go over how I'm testing, how I'm evaluating, how I chose some of the belts that I did, and then some of the metrics that I'm going to be using. So if you want to skip past all of that, then use the chapters below and you can just jump ahead. The next thing I'll say is, if you don't mind, please stop and hit that subscribe button. That'll just really help me. This video, probably more than any other, I've put just a lot of work on the front end. I've been researching, evaluating for legitimately a couple of months now. So if you can give me a follow on other platforms, hit subscribe here, and then turn on the notification to get notified of any other videos, that would be a huge help. So let's quickly hit a couple of disclosures. Number one, I'm not going to read off the spec sheet of every single belt. If you want to know the exact specs of what, a certain belt is made out of, look it up online and figure that out for yourself. Secondly, as I already said, every single one of these belts, with the exception of one, was sent to me for free. There's no financial exchange. I'm not getting paid by any of those companies, but some relationships have been developed along the way. However, I will still be as straightforward and non-biased as I possibly can. This is actually kind of painful. Some of the belts that I'm like, man, I really like those people. I wanted to like their belt a lot. I actually don't. So I may step on some toes, but my first priority is to you guys and giving you the best information that I can. And then lastly, I'm not an expert shooter. So if you're wanting an expert review on some of these belts, you're not gonna be able to get that from me. Having said that, my guess is most of you guys aren't expert shooters either, so how an expert manages certain gear may not necessarily apply to you. I also wanted to say a quick thank you to every company that participated in this and sent me a belt. That's super helpful. I want to say I got roughly like $1,500 worth of belts, and some of that was just like, repeats from the same company where they sent me multiple colors and variations and whatnot. But that was one of the reasons why I was not able to do a test like this before until I made this video, is because I just couldn't drop $1,500 just to find the correct belt. So thank you to all of those companies, and thank you to all of my followers who submitted recommendations. Every single belt I'm going to be evaluating exactly the same way, wearing the same clothes, and using the same gun and holster setup. All right, the 10 belts in the lineup are Aegis gear, Black Arch holsters, Dynamis, or actually that's what it says on the belt, but the company itself is called Crush Everything, Nexbelt, the Hunter Constantine carry belt, a belt from Ciguera gear, Whiskey7, Agonic, the Agonic EDB, which is everyday belt, Core Essentials, which is probably the highest recommended or most recommended, I would say. And then I will be using just a standard leather belt that I have carried in for years. And this is from Old Navy. So super, super basic. I'm going to evaluate every single belt in 5 different categories: concealability, comfortability, stability, adjustability, and style. There's definitely some overlap with these. Some influence the others, either positively or negatively, but I'm going to break those down as best as I possibly can. With concealability, I'm looking for 2 basic things, 2 metrics. One, how well does the belt conceal the gun and keep it pressed against your body? Some belts tend to bow out, and that's not good at all. It'll make the gun print a little bit more. Others really do a good job of keeping it close to you. And then, how well does the belt conceal itself? So I use the term belt shelf, and I'll show you this later, where the belt actually almost like creates a little shelf that your shirt sits on, and that's obviously not good. So how well does the belt conceal itself, and how well does the belt conceal the gun? Next up is comfortability, and this might be the biggest problem that I've had with a lot of belts that are fantastic in every other way. It's just they're so stiff and rigid, they really dig into your hips after a long period of time. So how comfortable is this belt over a long period of time and in different positions? For stability, I'm gonna be heading to the range and doing some shooting to kind of test that out, and then run around and draw as well. And the two things that I'm looking for here are, does the belt keep the gun in place so that I can draw consistently? If it's constantly moving around or not super rigid, then it's a lot harder to draw. And then the second thing is, how much does the gun actually move around? When sprinting up and down my range, certain belts really bounced around, and one, it was just uncomfortable, and two, I found myself pulling my speed a little bit because I was like, man, is this thing gonna go flying out of my pants? That's a really realistic scenario of potentially having to sprint and run away or run towards something and then draw your gun. So how a gun belt performs in that scenario does matter. For adjustability, I'm looking for two things as well. So pretty much have two metrics across most of these categories. And one of those is, how large of increments are you adjusting? Is it a, standard belt that has 1-inch holes, and so that's as tight or loose as you can go and you can't get any finer adjustments in that? Or is it something like the Core or Nexbelt that has this ratcheting system that allows you to adjust your length by probably like 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch, which is much better in my opinion. So that's the first thing, how large are the increments of adjustment? And then the second thing is, how easy is it to adjust your belt while it's on you? So this heavily influences comfort in my mind, because one of the most uncomfortable things is sitting down with a gun on for an extended period of time. If I go on a date with my wife, we might be walking around downtown for a little bit, and I can have my gun nice and tight in a good position to draw, really well concealed, and it doesn't bother me. But then if we go sit down at a restaurant for a couple of hours, I would love to be able to just loosen that belt up a little bit to make it much more comfortable while I'm sitting down in front of a table, and concealability doesn't necessarily, or stability doesn't really matter. And then when I stand back up, I want to be able to ratchet that thing down or easily, adjust and go up a hole without having any problems. So adjustability heavily influences comfortability in my opinion. The last category is style, which I fully admit is almost entirely subjective. And I will also add, to me, the most important thing for actually looking fashionable is to have a shirt that just hangs down naturally, because I never carry tucked, I always carry untucked. And so how well the belt minimizes and doesn't actually print itself is the main thing that I carry about. So if it's super concealable, that's a win for me, but I will, in this category of style, just be evaluating how well I think the belt looks. And one more thing that I'll add before I get into the first belt is, after I was on the range and I just shot a bunch of rounds, and I'll go over what my testing for the range time was, but afterwards, I called a buddy of mine who's a USPSA master and a really good concealed carrier, can shoot from concealed extremely well. And I was just asking him, I was like, dude, I didn't really notice any difference in ease of draw from these different belts. And I was like, yeah, they were subtle. And he agreed and was like, yeah, that's one, that's really interesting to know. But then two, in his mind, the most important thing for an EDC belt is concealability. How well does it keep the gun pressed against your body so that it's not pushing out and printing against your shirt? So concealability may be the most important factor in all of these, something good to keep in mind. First up is the Core Essentials Tactical Gun Belt. I primarily used for my evaluation one of their nylon ones with this buckle, which I believe was sent to me from Tier 1 Concealed. So that's a quick note on this belt. If you get a belt from Tier 1 Concealed, you're pretty much getting exactly the Core Essentials. Tier 1 also sells the Hunter Constantine belt, but I'll address that one when I get to it. So I started with the Core Essentials belt because in my mind, it's something of a gold standard, if you will. It's really great at everything. I don't think it's the best at everything, but it's really great at everything. And it was also the most consistently recommended to me. So let's get into what's good about this belt. First of all, it's nice and stable. As you can kind of see, there's very little warping going on here. And they developed this. I believe they claim to be the ones who invented this ratcheting system. There's other belts like the Nexbelt that also use it. And essentially what that does is it takes these little teeth here. It allows you to adjust the belt to any length that you want. And it's really, really easy to do. And I think that's a huge win. They have a million different options, both color, materials. They have brown leather, black leather, coyote tan, nylon black. They also have a couple of different materials that look like leather, but I think they're man-made and they're supposedly a little bit stronger, more durable. So tons of variety here. From what I can remember when I was looking at them, by far, Core Essentials has the most variation to their belt. So if that's something that's important to you, then that's a win in an extra category, an added note. As far as concealability goes, like I said, this belt is kind of right in the middle to me. It actually sits pretty slim, but I find that the buckle itself, and this is actually their slimmest buckle, some of them are a little bit bulkier, the buckle itself protrudes a tiny bit. Depending on your gun setup, this may matter. It may tuck nicely behind the holster and not matter at all. But overall, it keeps the gun very nicely against your body. It's hard to give it a rating or anything because it does its job. As far as the belt itself, you see a tiny bit of belt shelf, but not too much. It's a little bit more than I would like for my taste, if I'm being honest, but it's also, for how stable it is, it's not too bad at all. And I would guess that as time goes on, it will conform to your body a little bit, and that will improve how well it conceals. It's pretty comfortable because it is so rigid this way. That doesn't really give your hips or anything a lot of play when you're sitting down. But when we get to the adjustability, we'll see how, because it's so easily adjusted, that will significantly influence how comfortable it is. And I'm actually I'm gonna move up the adjustability. Let's talk about that for a second. So I didn't even have the category of adjustability in until I went to the range and carried with some of these guns for an extended period of time. And what I found was for the belts, this is the Ciguera gear, that only have 1-inch increments. Chances are you're not going to be able to have the belt fit you absolutely perfectly exactly where you'd like it to be on one of those notches. So you're going to compromise and either go a little bit more tight, which is going to be a little bit more stable, potentially harder to draw if the gun is too pressed against your body, but then also definitely less comfortable. Conversely, if you go 1 notch loose and decide to go on the loose side, it's definitely going to print a little bit more, both the belt and the gun, obviously, so it's not going to be as concealable. It's going to be a lot more comfortable, but it will probably bounce around a little bit more. When you have a belt like this that allows you to adjust it to the exact size that you need, that significantly bumps up the comfortability, the stability, and the concealability. So adjustability came to be an extremely important thing for me. And like I said, in this category, I'm looking at 2 main things. How easy is it to adjust with the belt on? And then how small are the increments? The increments on this are pretty much as small as you can possibly get. And then it is extremely easy to adjust with the belt on, as you can see here. This is without a doubt, in my mind, the most adjustable belt. So mid-tier in almost everything, but absolutely the best in what is potentially the most important category. So let's get into stability a tiny bit more. To test stability, I started with a reduced C-zone target at 10 yards. On the buzzer, drew from concealment and fired 2 rounds. I did 2 repetitions of the drill to establish a baseline, then sprinted to and from the 50-yard line, caught my breath, and did 2 more repetitions of the same drill. The idea was to test how much the gun bounced around while I was sprinting and see if the gun shifted in any way while running that would then impact my draw. Things were across every single belt, they were almost the same. There's a couple that I did notice things standing out to me, but for the most part, the draw was not really influenced even after running and things like that. Drawing with this belt was quite easy. It keeps the gun nice and tight and upright. Some other belts will bow forward, as I mentioned earlier, and I did not notice that with these at all. I don't know if over time that would start to happen, but I did not notice it in the amount of time that I've been using these. Now, as far as style goes, I'm gonna rank these belts pretty high as well because they do have a lot of nice options. With this one here, it's a black, slightly distressed leather. Like I said, they have a ton of different belt buckle options. This was potentially my favorite. And because of that, you can really get a lot of exactly what you're looking for. They have a dressier, shiny black leather. They also have a distressed, like lighter brown leather. So these definitely get ranked pretty high. The nylon ones look like any other nylon belt in my opinion, but some of the leather options and leather lookalike options do look quite sharp. Overall, if you are looking for a very adjustable, stable, but not the most stable belt on the planet, this is probably my go-to. And that's partially why I went with this one first, is because I wanted to have something of a baseline to establish everything else on top of. Next up is the Nexbelt. This belt is pretty much identical to the Core Essentials. I do believe that they just knocked off and maybe made some improvements, but I personally don't really see any differences. Now, this is the one belt on this list that I purchased myself. Sorry, one of two actually, that I purchased myself years ago. And to me, it was a little bit too bulky for most of clothes in the way that I dress. I dress a little bit more fitted than probably a lot of you guys do. So that's part of it. They do have a different buckle that's specifically designed for appendix carry and sits nicely off to the side. So really no complaints against this belt. I would categorize it right along with the Core Essentials. But if it were me, between these two, I would without a doubt say just get the Core Essentials. You have more options. You have the originality, if you will, and otherwise you're getting the same belt. Third belt up is the Blue Alpha belt with the Cobra buckle. And I will be honest, I don't 100% know who this belt is for or the purpose of it. It works just fine, and it has this Cobra belt buckle, if that's something that you really like. But I will say the people at Blue Alpha are wonderful people. They have some of the best customer service of anyone that I've talked to. And this is one that I really wanted to like, and I feel bad hating on them a little bit, but I just don't 100% see the purpose of this belt, how it fills a gap in the industry that was existing. To me, this isn't really solving any problems that, say, the Core Essentials had. But let's talk specifics. Concealability, pretty much didn't notice anything different. It is slightly slimmer for the belt, so there was a little bit less belt shelf in my opinion. The buckle bulges out a little bit, but it overall still did a really good job of concealing itself. After running around, so this is something related to stability, but after running around, I noticed the belt bowing out a little bit. I'm trying to demonstrate that here, where it does have some give this way, and I don't think the camera's focusing, but it does have some give this way. And so I would knock it a point in terms of concealability because of that. Comfortability is pretty good. It's a little bit less stiff than the Core Essentials, so it's slightly more comfortable, I would suppose, because of that. But in terms of adjustability, I needed to start doing that category instead. In terms of adjustability, you can get it to the exact increment that you want it to because you have Velcro to adjust here, loosen this up, which is very hard to do. It's stiff. I have it right to the length I want it. So you can get it to the exact length that you want it. But changing that is virtually impossible. And while it's on, there's no chance of you being able to loosen it while sitting down. So on one of the metrics for adjustability, it's fantastic. On the other one, it's horrible. So that significantly impacts comfortability to me. But it doesn't impact stability because you can get it to the exact length that you want. It is a pretty stable belt. Now on the range, I noticed it bowing out a little bit, and I did feel it moving up and down a good bit while I was sprinting. That didn't really seem to affect my draw, but it was something that I was aware of. As far as style goes, this isn't gonna do that great for me. It's nylon with Velcro. So I'm gonna give this a pretty low ranking for style, for adjustability, and for comfort. Just overall, I wasn't super happy with this. If there were no other belts on the market, it works, it does its job, but I would never choose this over the Core Essentials or the Nexbelt. Now, why should you get this belt? If you really want that Cobra belt buckle. Otherwise, like I said, I wouldn't recommend it over the other ones. Next up is the Ciguera gear belt, and this one's actually really interesting to me. It's a little bit different from anything else on the market that I've seen. It's made of pretty much the same type of material as the other nylon reinforced belts, but instead of being some sort of ratcheting system or a Cobra belt buckle, it has just your standard everyday clasp, needle, whatever this is called, which definitely in my opinion makes it look a lot better than some of the other options out there. I also just want to say that for whatever reason, when I first put this belt on, I was like, I really like this belt. So I was pleasantly surprised and found myself really liking this a lot more than I would have expected to. It just kind of feels good. and to me is a really good balance of being stiff and flexible. It just kind of hits a sweet spot for me. So I did actually like this belt quite a bit, but let's get into specifics. Concealability. Nothing crazy different here. I did find that it held the gun in place really, really well. And then the belt itself is pretty minimal, as you can see here, in having any sort of print. The buckle is actually one of the things with some of these belts that I have a problem with. One of the main things that I have a problem with is the buckle will just be so bulky. And in the case of this one, I didn't find that to be true at all. I thought it sits quite nicely and slim and sits right next to my holster and creates almost no extra mass there. So overall, did a great job of concealability. I would say a little bit better than the Nexbelt. And I'll continue kind of comparing all of the belts to that. Comfortability, like I said, it kind of fit me well and was a good sweet spot between being extremely stiff and having a little bit of flexibility. So rigidity and flexibility was kind of like right in the middle. When we get to the adjustability phase, of course, we will note that because it's a buckle, we only have these 1-inch increments here, which makes it a lot harder to get the perfect fit. For me, it is the absolute perfect fit on one of these notches. That does not happen, I want to say, with any of the other belts that you have these like 1-inch increments. I'm right in between, so I have to choose between either going too tight or too loose. And it's really not great to go in that either direction. This one sits kind of perfectly, but if I were to lose 5 pounds and gain 5 pounds, that probably wouldn't be the case anymore. So not adjustable there. Because of the stiffness of the belt, it is also difficult to adjust while you're sitting down. It's not possible. You can pull that buckle out to the side and go down a notch while you're sitting down, but it's definitely not as easy as a ratcheting system. So adjustability is pretty low, which should affect the stability and should affect the comfort, but it didn't for me. The gun was nice and stable. It didn't move around. I didn't really notice it moving around much while I was running, and it was quite comfortable for me to wear. Even I think I wore it for like maybe 4 hours straight is the most that I wore it for, and I didn't have any problems with it. And then as far as style goes, I do think it's one of the better looking options just because of that realistic actual standard belt buckle, that it's not a bad looking belt at all. And you can get this in a couple of different color nylons, I want to say, and then a couple of different colors of belt buckle. Not a ton of variation, but sometimes that's better, having fewer options. So on paper, the worst thing about this belt is the adjustability, but in actual use, if it fits you well, I did find this to be a very solid option. A lot of the belts that we have left are a little bit more different and unique. Some of the earlier ones, like the Nexbelt compared to the core belt, pretty much the same thing. The Blue Alpha, same concept, different buckle, but not a whole lot of information there to cover. Now we're getting into some, like the Hunter Constantine belt, that is very, very different. So this belt is a completely different design. You have a stiff piece of material in the front, and then the entire back portion is elastic that has quite a lot of stretch to it. And I will say, in my opinion, too much stretch. I think they should use a stiffer elastic than this. It has this buckle here, or band, that allows you to adjust the length. It comes in a couple of different sizes. This allows you to adjust the length to a good spot. And then when you find your good in-between spot, you also have 2 notches where this can sit onto there. So you can go on a tighter setting or a slightly looser setting, which is really, really helpful. And we'll get to that in a second. Concealability, phenomenal when it comes to the belt printing itself, or the belt shelf. As you can see, this thing is just super slim all the way around. Even where the buckle is, there's just nothing protruding. So the belt itself adds no extra mass. However, because this isn't fixed, this front stiff part isn't fixed, it can bow out a little bit. And I've actually used this one quite a bit. Of all the belts, this is the ones that I've found myself wearing the most. And I noticed that it will start to bow out a little bit. So it doesn't do a very good job, I found, at concealing the gun. If you're carrying a larger setup, I would wager that this is not necessarily a good option. Comfortability, as I already said, phenomenal. This is absolutely the most comfortable belt on the market. More comfortable than any belt I've ever worn, I would say. Stability in terms of ease of draw, and then how well it keeps the gun in position while you're moving around, actually really surprised me. I was like, there's no way this thing is going to be super stable. Well, firstly, it does do a great job of holding the gun where it needs to be. And like I said, there's almost no variation from belt to belt in this category. A little bit, but almost none. But I felt none with this. This kept the gun exactly where I needed it to be to draw. I was really surprised about was stability during movement. I think because the elastic almost acted as a shock absorption system, the gun moved a tiny bit, but overall, even at a full sprint, it still wasn't uncomfortable. Not like some of the other belts that I was like, oh shoot, this is moving around way too much. I didn't experience that with this one at all. This one stayed where it needed to be, and when I went to draw afterwards, I had no issues. As far as adjustability goes, because you have the ability to move this strap in and out, if I can actually do it, that means you can get you have all of the increments that you want. There's no limit to how small of increments you can go and how small of adjustments that you can make. And then ease of adjustment with the gun on. This is where I think the 2-latch system is super helpful. I can tighten the gun and have it as tight as I want it to be as stable and concealable as possible on this notch. But then if I sit down for dinner for a couple of hours, or I get in my car and I'm like, man, I want to loosen up a bit, all I have to do is pop that out and slide that over. It's super easy and convenient on the side of your pants too, like with the, the ratcheting system. That's a good note. All of those systems sit on the side of your pants. So if you're carrying appendix carry, then you're able to make that adjustment without even lifting up your shirt. So win for ease of adjustment with a gun on, and then win for incremental adjustment. And here I'll add a note that the Hunter Constantine belt rebranded is one of the other tier 1 concealed belts. So like I said earlier, if you buy the Core Essentials tier 1 concealed belt, it's just Core Essentials rebranded. If you buy their other belt, it is this belt rebranded. And I believe the only change that they made is they added a 3rd notch, which I don't think is a bad idea. When it comes to style, if I was giving points, this thing would get 0 points because it looks like a piece of elastic and then a piece of nylon. There's no style to it whatsoever. The only functionality, which makes no sense, the only functionality behind the style of it is because it is so slim and it conceals pretty well in terms of the belt itself, it's not going to print and make your shirt look bulky. So who is this belt for? I think if you are carrying a lighter setup and you prioritize comfortability, then this is the best option there is. This is a very strong contender for me to have as not necessarily a primary belt, but something that I can throw on if I'm just simply wanting to be comfortable. Now, something that's a similar design, but not nearly the same design, is the Agonic EDB. So I'm going to say off the bat that I was super excited about this belt. A bunch of people that I follow and respect recommended this belt, and I wasn't super happy with it. So I'm just saying that at the very beginning so that I say it and it's in this video and I can't take it back, because I've also kind of made friends with Agonic, a couple of the people there, and I really wanted to like their belt, but there's a couple of problems that I have with it I'll get into a minute. So the design of this one is unique to anything else as well. Where it's similar to the Hunter Constantine belt is that you've got this little placard thing that simply slides onto the front of the belt, and it gives you stiffness in the front while the rest of the belt is less rigid. Now, I said that with the Hunter Constantine belt, the backing of it, the elastic is too loose. I think that should be tighter. This is elastic, but you can see the difference in give. So if you see how little my hands are moving compared to the Hunter Constantine, significantly more stretch. This is kind of the perfect stretch. So they made it out of this webbing material with notches on every level. And the idea is when you get the belt, you would cut it to the correct length, and then so that you would only have a little bit of extra in the back, and then this notches on to there. And the way that they always use it, and the way that it's recommended to be used, is you snap the gun onto the placard in the back. But snap the holster onto the placard in the back so that there's virtually from the front, you can't see the holster clips at all. Now, to me, again, if your shirt's covering that, that doesn't really matter that much. Where I have a problem with this, it's a great concept, and I think it's a great overall system and belt, and it's strong and stable, and we'll break that down in a second. But what I had the most problem with is this. So talking about belt shelf, this belt to me is the perfect representation of the worst possible scenario with belt shelf. Concealability. It holds the gun into position. For whatever reason, it felt a little bit not in place for me. The feeling of it was a little bit off, but I have nothing tangible to say as far as why. But it did conceal the gun well, and I know from other people that use this belt and carry like full-size 2011s with it, that this belt works for concealing the gun itself. Conceals the gun well, does not conceal the belt itself well. Stability, it did absolutely fine. There's a lot of stiffness to this belt itself, to the nylon portion. So there's really no problems there. And this placard does a great job of giving you a perfectly rigid material in the front. And I will also add, I have used this one as a good bit as well. And you can see, so they sent me two because they had a newer version that came out. And you can kind of see, I've only worn this one like once. This is relatively curved. This one's a lot more curved. It does start to mold to your body in a good way. And I found that to be super helpful and kind of boost concealment. But it definitely did a good job in terms of stability, kept the gun in place, and I didn't notice it moving around too much while I was running. Comfortability, I skipped over. Really not much to say here beyond what you would expect. It did feel super comfortable, and it doesn't dig into your hips. This is a nice soft material, albeit not super flimsy, but it is soft and doesn't hurt. What I find with some of the other belts is like it feels like you have a hard surface digging into your hips, and that can really bother me. Definitely not so with this one. Now, skipping ahead to adjustability, same problem here, and I think this is another thing, a big knock on it as well. Because you can only adjust in 1-inch increments, I landed on it being too tight on this notch and then too loose on the next notch. When it was too loose, and this is really problematic, with some of the other ones like the Ciguera belt, it's a pretty stiff belt. As you can see, this is a much stiffer material than this is. So if this was too loose, it still keeps everything upright, right? You can see it like that. Whereas with this one, this obviously flops. And then when it was too loose, I found that when I was running around, it did actually flop around a bit. So the adjustability negatively impacted the stability fairly significantly, and I didn't like that. And in terms of style, it's a good buckle. I can't say anything great about it though, because again, it's still nylon. It's very tactical looking. So if you want like a super tactical look, then this isn't a bad option, but otherwise it's basically nylon with a metal buckle in the front, and that's just not fantastic looking for me. So why choose this belt? Well, there are a lot of phenomenal shooters that I highly respect that use this belt, so maybe they're onto something that I'm not, but if it ends up fitting on the right notch for you, then I think it does provide a nice level of flexibility in the back with this webbing, and then stability with the placard in the front. But overall, I just don't think it does any one thing well enough. At the moment for me, I can't see myself ever using this belt. Moving along, we get into one belt that is going to cause a little bit of controversy. This is the Whiskey7 Caballero belt, I believe it is, or the Ranchero belt. I can't remember. They have two belts. One has a little bit more like cowboyish patterns on it, and then the other one is much more minimalistic. This is the more minimalistic one. And this belt is 100% leather, and I will comment, this is beautiful leather. This is a really pretty piece of leather. I don't believe it's reinforced. It is simply a very strong and stable and thick leather. And then in the front, you have, this looks familiar, we've got a little bit of this placard material like the Agonic EDB. So I say this is controversial because I was told that this company essentially stole their intellectual property, and they're in the middle of conversations to deal with that stealing of intellectual property. If that is exactly what's going on and that's being accurately represented to me, then there is a chance that this belt could be challenged and taken off the market. So let's get into the belt itself. Like I said, phenomenal piece of leather. I really love that. I'll say off the bat, this is the best belt in terms of style. No questions asked. It's not really my style, but that looks good. That's a good buckle. It's not super thick. One of the things that I don't love about all of these other belts is I typically don't wear something as thick as this. It's a little bit thinner. It's got some nice stitching going on. It has a really good looking belt buckle. And then this part, just a little bit of extra detail. Again, maybe not even my style, but a little detail there with multicam black. And I think that looks pretty good. What I have problems with, same thing as always, it seems. That is the most amount of material that I've ever seen stacked up on a belt in my entire life. It is just so thick. You have the loop here, double layer of this belt, this passing through, and then this little plastic thing underneath. It is just way too much. Also, because of how they have this set up, so you can take this placard off and move it further down to move it in this direction. But what I found when I was putting it on is it basically doesn't work unless I'm doing something wrong. I could not get it to work with the 2-clip holster system. It just doesn't fit onto it. So if you carry a 2-clip appendix system, don't get this belt. It will not work unless I'm doing something wrong. I honestly love the idea of taking a standard leather belt and putting something more stiff on it to reinforce that in just one part of the belt. I think they had a great idea and they need to fix a couple of things to make it better. Concealability, it held the gun in position just fine. Nothing crazy to talk about, but the amount of thickness here just made it way too bulky. So not great on the concealability factor there. It was definitely comfortable enough because it's not quite so thick and because it is just leather, it's not reinforced leather. It has a little bit of give to it. So I did think it was pretty comfortable in that sense. When we get to the adjustability factor though, again, dealing with the same thing. We only have, 1 inch increments here, unless you would have put another hole in, but I'm not a huge fan of doing that. With these 1 inch increments, that means that you're either going to be a little bit too snug or too loose, unless you get really, really lucky and land in the perfect sweet spot. For me, I did not. This was too tight, was how I ended up using it. Because when it was too loose, it was just way too loose and negatively impacted stability and concealability. So I have 3 main knocks against this belt. 1, the placard needs to have been longer to be able to use it with a 2-clip holster system and to just provide a little bit more room. 2, the ease of adjustability just isn't there, which makes it a lot more difficult to get it to the right fit, which then of course affects comfortability and stability. And then 3, this is just so bulky that the belt itself prints a little bit too much for me. So it does accomplish everything else just fine. It's just not very good at those 3 things that I mentioned. So if that's not an issue, if none of those 3 things are an issue for you and you just want a really good looking belt at a relatively higher price point because it is really good quality leather, then this is the belt for you. Otherwise, I don't recommend it. All right, 3 more belts to go. I know this is taking forever and I'm probably rambling way too much, so please forgive me for that. And thank you for watching all this way if you are still with me, but let's get through these last 3 as quick as I can. So third to last one is the Black Arch Holsters belt. This is a leather material. It feels almost man-made, but I do believe it's leather. And it has a different little latching system here where the belt comes in here and you come onto the notch right there. It's overall pretty stable. If I hold it this way, you can kind of see. And it's kind of in that middle sweet spot of not super rigid and also not super flexible. This looks pretty good, and there's one thing about it that I really, really like. When you lock this into place, this curve here fits perfectly next to the holster and makes the whole buckle system almost disappear entirely next to your holster. So that means what? You have almost no printing from the belt itself. Very little belt shelf, and the belt is super slim in that capacity. So as far as concealability goes, the belt does a good job. It also holds the gun just fine. I honestly didn't notice anything really differently compared from one to the other. I did notice the gun bouncing a little bit more with this belt, but that wasn't really a huge deal to me. It wasn't enough that I would be concerned. The problem comes when you get to adjustability. There's no way to adjust it other than these notches, and I found the notch because there's even just there, you can see there's this little tooth, and I don't know if you can see that, but there's this little tooth that sticks down to give you extra grip. And that means that the only way to move the belt is to loosen it, push it this way, then drop it down and then slide it. I found that to be very, very tricky to manipulate under the tension of the belt and gun being on. So the ease of adjustability with the gun on was not very good. And then the incremental adjustments, again, is not very good. So that then in turn for me affected the stability because I couldn't get it quite as tight. And I think that's why it was bouncing around when I was running. I couldn't get it as tight as I needed to. So we're seeing a pattern here that when you don't have that like fine adjustment, I think that can be a real problem for a carry belt, or at least in my mind, that's something that I would always recommend to look for. Draw was just fine though. I really had no issues there. There was just issues with the actual running around that I found. Now, as far as style, I think it's a decent looking belt. You know, it's a piece of leather with a very minimalist buckle, but if I'm being honest, it doesn't rank super high to me. Yeah, I just don't really know what to say about this one. I really love a few of these options and then I don't love some of them. Sure, it looks a little bit better. It's a tiny bit slimmer in this capacity, but it doesn't do any one thing different enough for me to take notice of it. So if you love Black Arch holsters and you use their holsters and you think they're a great company, then sure, you can go ahead and get this belt. Otherwise, I think there are better options. The Crush Everything Dynamis belt. Man, I'm being way too harsh on these. I love the last one that I'm getting to, so maybe that'll be good because right now I feel like I'm being mean to companies and I don't like it. But this belt it's basically just a piece of nylon, a long piece of nylon. There's no stretch to it whatsoever. It's just a piece of nylon. And then what it has going for their sell is it has all of these little pouches that are made of like elastic so you can slip, like lock picks in there, maybe some coins or anything else that you might need. So I think it was designed for more of a undercover type approach, but I will say off the bat, it does not work, in my opinion, for appendix carry at all. Why? Well, because you've got all of this material, coming back to this, even though this belt is super slim and there's no reinforcement, so it's the flimsiest belt we have, because it's got all of this Velcro and these little pouches, and that's not even counting putting anything in the pouches in there, you can't clip your belt on here. So it just flat out does not work for appendix carry. I tried clipping the belt here and putting the Velcro in front, and that still created so much bulge in the front that it didn't really work. And once that's the case, you can't adjust your belt whatsoever, especially if you have the clips over top. So my only thought is that either this isn't really intended for concealed carry, although I've seen it promoted for that, or you have to carry at 4 o'clock. Concealability, it actually did a good job of concealing the gun. I was shocked that it didn't really bow out too much. It kept the gun against my body. I don't know how, but it did. But then the belt itself prints like crazy and has a ton of belt shelf, so I didn't like that. Comfortability, it's not super rigid, so it doesn't necessarily dig into your hips, but it's also nothing to write home about. It wasn't like the Hunter Constantine belt that I'm like, oh, this is just so comfortable, I forgot that I had it on. I noticed this, and you do have to get it pretty tight in order for it to be stable and not bounce around. Stability itself, what are you going to expect? This is kind of flimsy. There's no reinforcement. But again, I was shockingly surprised. It held the gun in a good position. My draw was not affected, but I did notice it moving when I was sprinting. There was a good bit of movement there. The gun was still in position when I came back, but it was kind of an uncomfortable amount of moving around while I was sprinting. And as far as adjustability goes, you have 100% level of incremental adjustment because it is just Velcro. So in this case, you can adjust the belt as much as you want to, but when the gun is on, you have zero ability to adjust, not even a tiny bit. You have to take the gun off to be able to adjust this belt. So to me, that's kind of a big negative. Overall, I thought I would really like this belt, but I didn't know what to expect because I saw pictures of it and I was like, oh, that doesn't look reinforced, but maybe it is. And that Velcro looks like it's right in the front, so I wonder if that's going to be a problem for appendix carry, but I wasn't sure. So I was able to get it, and what I can say is no, it is not for appendix carry. No, it is not reinforced. Yes, if you want a bunch of tiny little pockets to hide things in, then this is the only belt like it that I've seen. Otherwise, it's not really even, in my mind, a carry belt. I don't think that it's meant for that, and I don't think it serves that purpose very well. Last belt to talk about is the Aegis Gear. I have no clue what the name is, but hopefully I just showed it on the screen before you. I say things like that and I don't know exactly how I'm going to edit this, so we will see. All right, initial comments about this belt. It is kind of a similar concept in the sense of having this chunky buckle to slide through to the Nexbelt. You don't have any sort of ratcheting system. Instead, what you have is this little knob that sits in place, and when you pull it up here, it now tightens down. So what that does is, at first I was like, why? Why do that? Well, the main reason is the more I pull on this, the tighter that gets. So it pretty much cannot come off. And in this case, it's really hard to undo. When I first got this belt in, I was instantly like, what in the world were they thinking? This buckle is massive. Why does it have to be so thick? Also, it was recommended to me by someone who is a phenomenal shooter, and they told me it is the most stable belt that you can possibly get. They were right. This thing is basically a battle belt, but it's meant for concealment. You absolutely could use it as a duty belt though. It is the most stable, stiff, rigid belt that I have here by far. In terms of concealability, I took this belt out of the box and I was like, there's no way in the world I'm never ever going to wear this thing, and I didn't even test it out until I was forced to, and I went to the range with all of the belts and I put this one on and I was like, oh crap, this actually conceals pretty well. I found it to be, this material isn't super thick, and I found it to sit really quite nicely. And the buckle honestly disappeared really, really well behind the holster. All of this portion here kind of dug in back there so that there was nothing of it printing forward. I expected this width to be sticking out, and that was stupid of me. That width of is not sticking out at all. It sat in quite nicely. So even though you have this super thick buckle, I didn't find that to be a problem when it came to concealability. It kept the gun perfectly in position, more so than any belt. The only way that I can describe it is, I made the comment earlier that the more rigid a concealed carry belt is, the more it feels like you're just drawing from an outside waistband holster and you don't have the gun pressed against your body. This is the gold standard for that. It basically felt like the gun was perfectly in position, immovable, and it made drawing that much easier. So obviously, now I just skipped ahead, but obviously that means that it's keeping the gun from printing and kept it nice and tight against your body. Part of the reason for that is the adjustability. What do we see here? Full incremental adjustments, and then super easy to adjust while the belt is on. You simply have to grab this, pop that back a little bit, and then you can slide it out. If you need to tighten it, push in, and then push that knob thingy back in there. So complete win on the adjustability, which then of course influences the stability. You don't have to worry about it being too loose or too tight. You get it exactly how you want it. And yeah, I was honestly super impressed by it. In terms of style, it wouldn't get a 0 out of 5. It would maybe get a 2. It's clean. The buckle looks clean, but you don't get this belt if you are looking for a cool, stylistic belt in any sense. You get this belt if you want to carry a Glock 34 with an extended mag in both the gun and to the side, and 2 extra magazines on it. You can literally carry whatever you want, and this belt will not move. It didn't move while I was running. It didn't move at all. And somehow it did that by not being terribly uncomfortable at all, and by not being super bulky at all. As I said, very pleasantly surprised by this belt. I thought it was a great option. It is a little bit pricey, but I thought it was a great option. And I chatted with the guy at Aegis Gear. I believe he's the owner, and super nice and wonderful to talk to as well. So that was kind of a pro in my mind. So I'm going to use this belt, the Aegis Gear, to springboard into overviewing all of the belts and telling you which are my favorites in each of the categories and which belt I would recommend to you if you were looking for one thing in particular. This belt does one thing in particular really, really well. If you are looking for a stable belt that is easily adjustable and very comfortable, this is my #1 recommendation. When it comes to a comfortable belt, if you're looking for a super comfortable belt, the Hunter Constantine is a 100% win, no questions asked. This is the most comfortable belt on the market, as I said earlier. So if that is your priority, but you also want a belt that is very easily adjustable and does a pretty good job of concealment because it itself is nice and slim, then I think this is a great belt. Style, I don't want to because of the problems that I had with it, but I have to say style 100% wins out with the Whiskey7. But I still would say, unless those problems aren't problems for you, I really wouldn't recommend this belt. Concealability, I'm actually gonna give this to the Ciguera gear. It was very slim, and like I said when I was talking about it, it really hit the perfect sweet spot for me of rigidity and flexibility. It conceals well, and it hits everything else reasonably well. So for number one concealment recommendation, I would say the Ciguera gear belt. Number one belt overall in every category, hands down, goes to the Core Essentials belt. It does everything extremely well. I don't think it does anything other than adjustment outstandingly well. That it does outstandingly well, and because that does impact the other categories, perhaps that's why it ranks so high. But if I were to simply give you a basic recommendation, it would be go check out Core Essentials because they also have a bunch of other options. And because of all of those other options, I'm also going to give this like an honorary mention in terms of style, because I do think some of their belts are pretty nice looking. Some of their like black leather with this type of buckle definitely gives you a higher end, dressier executive belt, I would say. Absolutely a number one in terms of belt overall. And also there's just a lot of people's opinion behind me on that. One, it's carried by Tier 1 Concealed. I highly respect those guys. And then two, I got it recommended more than any other belt on the market. Last belt to talk about, and I'm not really going to get into any details of it, but just address how well it performed, is just my old Old Navy leather belt. I'm not going to take time to break it down because this isn't a belt that you can go and use, but what I wanted to compare against this for is to see how much using an EDC belt or a designated EDC belt actually mattered. And what I found was that when it came to concealability, I didn't have too many issues with this other than the gun starting to bow out. So the gun itself would print a little bit more, but the belt itself would not print at all. Because you don't have incremental adjustments, you can't get the size just right. So that's kind of negative, but a bunch of the other belts had that as well. And because of that, that did impact comfortability. Now, in terms of stability, this is where I had the most problems. When I was sprinting around on the range, this was just flopping all over the place. And when I went to draw, at first I was like, no, the gun's staying in position, nothing's wrong. But I had the most trouble drawing from this because just like with the Aegis gear belt feeling basically like I'm drawing from outside waistband, this belt felt on the other side. Felt like the gun was so tightly pressed against my body that I wasn't able to grab it well and get a good purchase. And that's something that I've had problems with a subcompact, very slim grip gun anyway. I did that test to decide whether or not I thought it was necessary to get an EDC belt, and my conclusion was yes, you should definitely get an EDC belt. So finally, at the very end, what is my recommendation? What is the belt that I have chosen to use for myself? Because that's what I said at the beginning, is I wanted to find the best belt for me. And that's what all of this was about, was testing all of these different belts in search of what works best for me. And out of the ones that I do like and recommend, it's hard for me to promote one over the other, but what I found myself caring about the most is comfortability and adjustability, because as I have now rehashed a million times over, how adjustable your belt is really impacts the stability and concealability of it. So the Hunter Constantine belt is the one that I have found myself using the most. For my not super heavy setup, especially when I use the Xiphos Elite from Tier 1, where I'm not carrying an extra magazine, that's saving me the weight of 17 rounds, which is significant. I have found this to just be a really good summer light clothing setup that conceals pretty well, keeps the gun in a good position, allows me to adjust very, very easily if I'm sitting down for extended periods of time, and it is so comfortable that I forget I'm wearing it. So this is my top choice. My second choice that I honestly have found myself using without a whole lot of rationale is the Ciguera gear belt. I can't say it's my top choice because of the lack of adjustment that just makes it problematic to me. And at the moment it fits perfectly, but again, there's just no adjustment, no ability to change things as I'm wearing it for extended periods of time. And that's a big negative for me. So as my number 2, I'm gonna have to go with the Core Essentials if I'm wanting to do something that's a little bit more stable. So these 2 belts, Core Essentials, Hunter Constantine, are the ones that have won out for me. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I put more thought, research, analysis into this than any other one that I've made, but I found it super helpful and found out things that I didn't know that have benefited my concealed carry game. I hope it does the same thing for you. If so, please hit that subscribe, follow me on Instagram, and as always, be civil, stay savage, and I'll see you in the next one.